the topic of my talk today is flexible jobs and whether they can help parents in transition into parenthood. Okay, we're going to talk about Australia, and I'll tell you in a bit why are we focusing on Australia. And neither me nor my PhD student have anything to do with Australia. This is really driven just by data availability, and also the context of the labor market in Australia is quite favorable for this particular topic. Okay, so as already been told, this is joint work with my PhD student, Shuye Yu, and probably 75% of credit should go to him and not to me. For that paper, this is the first time I'm presenting the paper. It was usually Shuye who presented it, so that's also a new experience for me. Okay, so the outline of the talk is pretty standard. I'll start with some background information, then tell you a little bit about the empirical evidence that's already out there on the topic. I'll tell you about the data and the sample selection, the methodology we use in the paper, and then hopefully convince you that our results confirm that flexible jobs do actually make parents happier. Now, maybe I already should stress that we are not trying to say here that flexible jobs make parents happy. All we're trying to say is that they help alleviate a drop in self-perceived happiness of parents in the transition to parenthood. Okay. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them during the talk. You can either just start talking and interrupt me, or put the question in the chat box, and I'm happy to take questions during the talk. If something is not clear, then also please stop me, to clarify things. Okay, so before I jump into the details of this paper, I thought it would be nice to see, you know, what is the universe of the parents that around us, in a sense. Sorry. So again, the paper talks about Australia, but if we look at EU, we can see that there is quite a large number of households with children, which means that this is not a negligible thing, and we can actually think that caring about parents with children is important. So here we see that about 60 million, I think, there's about 60 million households with children present in them. There is, of course, more households without children, but that doesn't mean that there is more people without children and with children. These are, of course, households of different ages. So this includes students' households, as well as households of parents whose children no longer live in those households. Right, those will be classified here as households without children. Okay, so clearly there is a lot of parents with children out there, and there is growing evidence that shows that people with children tend to be less happy than people without children. So the question is maybe not so much why, but what can be done to improve the quality of life of parents with children, especially small children. Okay, so there is a very large literature that talks about what is the value of children to parents. And sort of the main things that are mentioned in the literature are that children satisfy parental emotional needs. So there is a certain psychological benefit to having children. There's also evidence showing that children, of course, provide material support to the family. That's not only true in developing countries, that's also true in developed countries, especially when we think about people in the old ages. They very often rely on support on their children, from their children. There is evidence that shows that children encourage parental social engagement, which then has certain positive spillovers on other aspects of parental life, such as success on the labor market. And also we see sometimes that children contribute to parents' personality development, which again usually has positive spillovers to other aspects of life. So overall, there are quite a few benefits that children present parents with. Okay, but when we look at the empirical evidence, we see that again, there's a lot of studies that show that people without children are actually happier than people with children. And also there is a growing evidence that shows that when you look at parents themselves, that their own life satisfaction decreased after parenthood, so after the birth of children. Okay, and here there's an example of the trajectory of life satisfaction or subjective well-being. So small disclaimer, in this paper or in this talk, I will use life satisfaction, subjective well-being, or happiness as synonyms. Okay, so there is some distinction in the literature, but we don't make the distinction in this paper. So think of life satisfaction, subjective well-being, or happiness as equal terms for the purpose of this talk. Okay, so here on these two graphs, we see these trajectories of subjective well-being for fathers and mothers. Fathers are on the left and mothers are on the right. And on the horizontal axis, we have number of years before and after the birth of the child. So time 0 is the time in which the child is born. And then we can look at the years preceding childbirth and also at the years after childbirth. And we see a pretty clear pattern. Before childbirth, especially fathers remain pretty flat in terms of the development of subjective well-being. Then there's a drop at childbirth, and then slowly the trajectory goes back to the initial level. For mothers, the pattern is similar, but we see a little bit of a jump in the years just before childbirth, which is something that the literature calls an anticipation effect, and this is a bump in subjective well-being in anticipation of the birth of the child, right? But in both cases, we see that at the event, the life satisfaction goes down, and it takes quite a couple of years for that life satisfaction to go back to the levels before the child was born. Okay, so clearly having children is not just pure pleasure, and clearly there are some costs involved in having children as well, which cause this drop in self-perceived happiness. And we can separate that variation in subjective well-being caused by parenthood into two parts: the good stuff, which is called just parenthood, and this is all the stuff that enhances subjective well-being. So all the things that the positive things that children bring to the parents. But there's also cost of parenthood, right? So having children is expensive in terms of time and money, and it often leads to work-family conflicts, and that can have a very negative effect on perceived happiness. Okay, so what parents do to reconcile this work-family conflict? Well, they can try to adjust their labor market behavior, right? And there is a lot of evidence from the literature showing that that around the childbirth, people, especially mothers, change their labor market behavior, and some couples go for household specialization or specification, which pretty much means that one parent, usually the mother, drops out of the labor market. Sometimes women opt for self-employment in order to gain some more flexibility, and that's again that's usually the mothers that do that. And then there's a growing literature that tries to establish the role of flexible employment in and how this affects parents' happiness around childbirth. And this is exactly what's at the heart of this particular paper. So again, what we're trying to see here is whether parents who are entitled to flexible work arrangement experience a smaller decline in subjective well-being than parents who are not entitled to flexible employment. All right. We can talk about different types of flexibility. The three types that we will consider in this paper or in this talk are contractual flexibility, temporal flexibility, and spatial flexibility. Okay, so the contractual flexibility means that workers are entitled to adjusting the total hours of work. So, for example, they can work part-time or full-time, or they can sometimes adjust the hours continuously. Okay, so they can choose exactly the number of weekly hours that they would like to work. Temporal flexibility means that people can decide working duration. So self-scheduling is an example of temporal flexibility, and that means that people can choose what time they want to start their workday and what time they want to end their workday. And spatial flexibility means that people can decide where to work. So, for instance, they are entitled to home-based work. Okay, and those are the three types that we will look into in our context of Australia. Okay, so like I already told you that the reason why we look at Australia is because the labor market conditions are quite favorable for that in many countries there's still such a thing as a flexibility stigma, which is usually mostly affecting people in part-time jobs. Okay, so in many countries, part-time jobs are considered inferior to full-time jobs, which means that people do not want to select into part-time employment, even if this might be beneficial for them from, for instance, a work-family conflict perspective. All right, so when we look at Australia, we believe that this is not the case. Okay, so in Australia, these flexible work schemes are very well established and they have been used very commonly. I think the uptake of flexible work started in sometime in the 90s, so there is a pretty long history of flexible work schemes there. In 2009, there was a Fair Work Act introduced, which gave all parents who have worked for the same employer for at least a year and who have school-aged children or younger children, the right to adjust their working hours and physical location of their job. Okay, so in essence, starting from 2009, all parents can adjust their working hours, they can adjust their space where they work, and they can adjust the start and the end time of their work. Okay, of course, this is all within some limits. It doesn't mean that someone who now works 5 hours a week can go to the employer and say that as of tomorrow they want to work 35 hours a week. So there are some rules on what parents can do, but this gave parents quite a lot of flexibility in how they can organize their work week, and there is evidence that shows that people actually took advantage of that law. Okay, so for instance, in the Netherlands, there is a similar law that's been introduced in 2000 that doesn't only apply to parents but all employees. So in principle, all employees have the right to adjust their working hours as well as the physical location of the work, but there is evidence showing that people don't really do that. They don't ask employers for those adjustments, and the main reason why they don't do it in the Netherlands is because they think that their request will be rejected, even though in both in Netherlands and in Australia, employers, of course, can reject those requests for adjustments into the working weeks, but only if there is a valid business reason to do so. Okay, so they cannot, they have to justify why that request is being rejected, and in essence why they cannot accommodate the needs of the employee. Okay, so it is possible to work flexibly in Australia. It is not considered inferior to non-flexible jobs. So it seems like a pretty good labor market context to study how flexibility helps parents in alleviating this drop in subjective well-being. Okay, and it is also the case that these part-time jobs are a very common choice for working parents, and again, usually mothers. And there is this setup where there is one partner with a full-time job and the other partner with a part-time job is very common among parents in Australia. Okay, so it seems that the context is reasonable. All right, so the data we use is a household income and labor dynamic in Australia survey, in short HILDA. It's an extremely good data set for studying any labor market related behaviors. It's a 17-wave household panel survey. It started in 2001, and of course it's ongoing. In that particular paper, we used 16 waves of HILDA from 2002 to 2017, and that's because in the first wave, some important questions on flexibility were not available. So we cannot use the first wave, and the 2017 was the last wave that was available when we were writing the paper. So, but the panel is ongoing, and the data really has endless information on households. We have to do put some restrictions on our sample, right? Beyond the fact that people need to have children, of course. We're also going to look at people that are between 18 and 55 years old. Actually, for women, that upper bound is set at 45 years old, and that's because we cannot distinguish between biological and adopted children in the data set. Okay, so we're going to assume that these children occurring at the older ages are due to adoption, and the children occurring at the earlier ages of the parents are with relatively high probability being biological births. And the reason why we do not want to have adopted children here is that we think that the process around childbirth is very different than the process around arrival of an adopted child. However, we do some robustness checks when we throw in everybody pretty much into the sample, and the results don't change much. So that selection isn't particularly important for the results that we're getting. We're also looking only at households where we have both parents present. So we're looking at individuals having a married or cohabitating heterosexual partner in the household. Of course, we have to have individuals who have children within a certain period of time. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the methodology in a moment, but in essence, what we do here is called an event study. So we don't just simply compare people with children and people without children. We are following people over time, and we are looking at their subjective well-being around the event of a childbirth of a given child. Okay, and we're going to look 3 years before the child is born and 5 years after the child is born. Okay, so when we do our sample selection, we need to look at individuals who are in the period between 3 years prior to and 5 years after the childbirth. All right, which means that, of course, older children are in essence not taken into account in that particular event study analysis. However, we do control for the number of children, so we do know whether these children are present in the household or not, and we do take it into account in our models. Okay, so in total we have about 35,000 individual year observations with about 6,000 individuals, and about half are men and half are women. So it's a pretty nicely balanced sample. So what we're trying to explain, right, is subjective well-being of people. So our dependent variable is going to be a self-reported subjective well-being. Okay, so the way this subjective well-being was elicited from the data, it was or from individuals, sorry, it was just with a single question. People were asked the following question: all things considered, pick a number between 0 and 10 to indicate how satisfied are you with your life. Okay, so people pretty much had to just pick a number, and they knew that the number has to be between 0 and 10, and the higher the number, the more satisfied with the life people are. And the problem with that is that this is not really a continuous measure of happiness, right? So obviously the first problem is that this is a self-reported measure, which means that it's not particularly objective, right? So it's very likely the case that what I think is a 6 is not what one of you thinks a 6 should mean, right? So we cannot think that my 6 is the same as somebody else's 6. Okay, and that is a problem, and that's a problem that's established in the literature. And what's often done is that people are given description of what each number mean, and then they ask to choose the number that they think that best describes their own individual situation. But in this particular survey, just this question, again, people just pick a number between 0 and 10, which denotes how satisfied they think they are with their life. Okay, so the second problem with that is that even though we have integers from 0 to 10, right, we cannot think of it as a continuous number, really, right? So we have to decide whether we're gonna believe that that this interpretation fits the cardinal interpretation of numbers or the ordinal interpretation of numbers, right? So a cardinal means that in essence it's like counting, right? Or like saying how many of something do we have, right? So in essence, the distance between the numbers matter, right? And they are meaningful, right? So when we count from 0 to 10, the distance from 1 to 2 is the same as from 2 to 3, and the same as from 3 to 4, etc. If we have an ordinal interpretation of these numbers, then these numbers are just words that denote the order in a set. right? So the distance between the 1 and 2 is not the same as the distance between 2 and 3 and should not be interpreted as being the same. Now, this is important because when we make an assumption of whether it's a cardinal and ordinal interpretation, that has implication for the method that we can use to estimate our models. So luckily, there is a literature that shows that, in essence, it doesn't matter. When we look at these studies that use dependent variables based on these self-reported measures reported on a scale, it doesn't really matter if we use a cardinal and ordinal interpretation from the estimation point of view. Okay, so in our case, what we're going to do, we're going to say, well, we're going to go with the easiest possible option. We're going to think of those as being cardinal numbers, which means that we can use methods for continuous dependent variables to estimate our models, right? So very easy. In essence, that means that we're going to be doing OLS. However, we do run a robustness check in which we admit that maybe this is a very strong assumption. Maybe we need to take into account that these are ordinal numbers, and we estimate a nonlinear model, which confirms our results, but we decided to stick with the cardinal interpretation in the main paper because the model is much easier to work with and much easier to interpret. And as the results don't change, there is no value added from going for the more difficult option. All right, so that's going to be our dependent variable. So it's going to be again a measure of self-reported subjective well-being, which is just a number between 0 and 10. And we're going to think about this as a continuous number, even though, like I said, this is not necessarily the right way to think about it. But from the perspective of the estimation, it doesn't matter, as the literature shows. Okay, so the key independent variable in our specification are going to be these period indicators. Okay, so like I told you, we're going to be looking at individuals over time. Okay, and at each point in time, we're gonna be looking at whether that individual has a child born in that particular time period, or whether that person had a child born 1 period before, 2 periods before, or 3 periods before, or whether this person will have a child born into the household in the next period, or 2 periods from now, or 3 periods from now, 4 periods from now, 5 periods from now. Okay, so we're looking from 3 periods before the childbirth and 5 periods after the childbirth. All right, so here's the table that hopefully helps understand how are we defining these period indicators. So again, these period indicators are supposed to tell us whether at each time t, how far a given individual is from childbirth of a particular child. Okay, so here we have an example of a person who has 2 children. Okay, here we have child 1 and child 2, and we're looking at this person for 7 consecutive years. And that particular person had the first child born in t equals 1, and another child was born in t equals 5. Okay, so within this span of 7 years, 2 children were born in the household in which individual I lives in. All right, so if the first child is born in t equals 1, then you can see here that for t equals 1, the indicator corresponding to, in essence, time 0, so the capital T, is equal to 1, and all other indicators are equal to 0, right? Because so that means that in time t, a child is born into the household. Okay, so now when we look at t equals 2, so 1 period in the future, right? That child that was born in time t, now this person is a year from the birth of the child, so the indicator for t plus 1 is equal to 1. Okay, and the indicator for t equals so the indicator of t is equal to 0, right? Because now again the child was born a year before. But now we can also see that the indicator for t minus 3 is equal to 1, because we know that in period 5 another child is born. Okay, so that person in time 2 is 3 periods before the birth of the second child and 1 period after the birth of the first child. Okay, and that's why t minus 3 is equal to 1 and t plus 1 is equal to 1 and everything else is equal to 0. right? And that's how these time indicators are constructed in every time period. So we can go to the next time period, t equals 3. Now this person is 2 years after the birth of the first child, so t plus 2 is equal to 1, and 2 years before the birth of the second child, so t minus 2 is also equal to 1. Everything else is equal to 0. Right, and that's how we construct these indicators. So now, of course, when these children become old enough, they sort of drop out of this period indicators scheme, but we will still be controlling for these children with the independent variables. Okay, we will control for the number of children in the household. So we're not exactly forgetting about those children, but because our focus is how does the subjective well-being evolve around the birth of the child, we limit our observation window to some periods before and after childbirth. Okay. All right. So the second sort of set of the key independent variables are the variables that denote flexibility. Okay, so here again, we're looking at contractual, temporal, and spatial flexibility. The contractual flexibility is something that we can deduct from the data. Right, so we observe exactly how many hours individuals work from the self-reported working hours, and then from that we can deduct whether they work full-time or part-time, or we can look at a continuous measure of hours. Okay, for temporal and spatial flexibility, we use the 2 questions from the survey in which people were asked to indicate whether they are entitled to temporal or spatial flexibility. Okay, so these questions were not asked in order to find out whether people actually use this option, but they were just asked to know whether people are entitled to temporal or spatial flexibility. Okay, so for instance, the question for temporal flexibility was as follows: indicate whether you or other employees working at a similar level to you at your workplace would be able to use flexible start and finish times. Okay, so again, people were not asked whether they themselves use these flexible start and finish times. They were asked whether they are entitled to it. Okay, so that's how we're going to define these flexibility indicators. We're going to rely on the questions in which people were asked to say that temporal or spatial flexibility is available to them. Okay, and then we have a whole bunch of other control variables such as self-evaluated health, partner self-evaluated health, age, income, number of resident children younger than 18, number of non-resident children younger than 18, whether people use childcare or not, whether they're self-employed or not, and we know whether they are in a supervisory position or not, and we also know what is the partner's flexibility. I think at the end we left the partner's flexibility out of sort of a detailed analysis. We just used it as a control because it wasn't showing anything interesting. It's the flexibility of the job of a given individual that matters, and not the flexibility of the partner. Okay, so this is just a standard summary statistics. We can look at these main variables among men and women. There's nothing particularly striking here. So in the first line, we see that the mean of subjective well-being among men and women is pretty similar. Women appear to be slightly happier than men, but that is not statistically significant. The difference is not statistically significant. We see a pretty traditional pattern in terms of working hours. So 85% of men work full-time, 6% work part-time, and 8% doesn't have a job at all. Among women, that incidence of full-time work is very low, only 26%. Part-time and no work are much more popular, with 35 and 40% respectively. Okay, and then the next 4 lines shows us the distribution by hours. So again, men tend to work full-time or really a lot, right? More than 51 hours a week, while women very rarely work more than 51 hours a week, and they are more likely to work less than 34 or 40 hours a week. So in essence, women work less hours than men in Australia. When we look at this entitlement to temporal and spatial flexibility, there's no difference in temporal flexibility between men and women, but it seems that women are slightly more likely to be entitled to spatial flexibility than men. Okay, now this can be a result of different occupational selection of men and women, but we will control for that later on. Okay, so now I'm going to show you lots of things from the data, what's actually happening and what do parents do when the children are born. Okay, so here we're looking at the working hours of men and women around the birth of the child. On the left-hand side, we have men. On the right-hand side, we have women. On the horizontal axis, we have these period indicators. So again, T means that's the period in which the child is being born, and then T+1, T+2 to T+5 are the 5 periods after childbirth, and T-1 through T-3 are the periods prior to childbirth. Okay, and this green line that goes for both the graphs shows working hours, and the different colors on the bars shows us what is the share of men or women in different hourly brackets in terms of the weekly hours of work. Okay, so you can see that pretty much nothing happens for men when children are born. Hours remain very stable at about 45 a week, and also the distribution into different hours is also relatively stable. When we look at women, we clearly see that that a lot is happening around childbirth. So more women drop out of the labor market and they become non-employed, and more women decrease their working hours. And more importantly, you can clearly see that the average working hours decrease from about 35 to about 25 a week, and they pretty much stay at that level. Okay, so sort of the bottom line is that men do not adjust their hours while women do, and it seems that they do so quite permanently. This shows us something about the temporal flexibility. So again, whether people are entitled to self-scheduling or not. And again, among men, not much is happening. These bars are relatively equal for all these different time indicators. Whereas for women, again, we can see this huge increase in non-employed women, and also this pretty large decrease in women who do not have any access to self-scheduling or some access to self-scheduling. And then when we look at spatial flexibility, again, not much is happening among men. There is a slight increase here. You can see at T+1 and T+2, there's a slight increase in the number of men, or the share of men that are entitled to home-based work, but it doesn't seem like it's particularly significant. Okay, so it could be that it's fathers of slightly older children that become a little bit more involved in caring for the children, and they tend to work from home a little bit more, but yeah, that's just speculation. And again, when we look at women, there's this huge jump in non-employment, and not much is really happening for the other two categories. Okay. When we look at the trajectory of subjective well-being around childbirth by gender, so from mothers and fathers, we see the same pattern that I showed you at the very beginning that was taken from a different paper. So we see that there is relatively stable levels of subjective well-being prior to childbirth, right? And then at time T, there's this huge drop in subjective well-being, and then actually the drop continues, and you can see slight leveling for women. We don't really see much leveling for men. Men's or fathers' subjective well-being just keep decreasing even 5 years after childbirth. And the one thing that is different from the graphs that I showed you at the beginning is that there we saw that the subjective well-being goes back to sort of the the reference period, which was 5 years before childbirth, and for us it does not seem to be the case. okay, the drop is more permanent. So even 5 years after the childbirth, it seems that the subjective well-being of parents still does not go back to original levels. But we are not particularly interested in just estimating the trajectory of subjective well-being, right? We want to know how do parents in different jobs in terms of flexibility, how do they differ in terms of subjective well-being? Okay, so that's what we see here. So again, we start with contractual flexibility, so hours. When we look at men, we clearly see that, you know, men are just happiest when they work a lot. So these fathers that are non-employed have very low subjective well-being and really experience a significant drop. And the fathers that work full-time, their subjective well-being seems to be always highest, also relative to the part-time working fathers. Whereas when we look at mother, we see an opposite picture, right? We see that the mothers that are working full-time are the ones that suffer the most. So this is the blue line, and these are the mothers that have this really significant drop in subjective well-being. And, you know, it drops up to T+3, so 3 years after childbirth, and then goes up a bit, but still remains below starting level. Okay, and then when we look at self-scheduling, here we see that that fathers that are entitled to self-scheduling seems to be doing better than fathers who are not entitled to self-scheduling. So the red line is the fathers that are entitled to self-scheduling, and it seems to be above the blue line pretty consistently. It does not seem like you know, as dramatic as the full-time, part-time sort of comparison among mothers, but it seems like there might be something going on for these for fathers and the ability to self-schedule. And then when we look at women, we also see that self-scheduling seems to improve women's subjective well-being, but again, that is not as stark as decreasing working hours. And here we're looking at spatial flexibility, and again we see that home-based work, both for fathers and mothers, seems to be improving their happiness, although for women those differences are tiny and not significant. For men, it seems like there might be something more going on. All right, so but again, these are just trajectories from the raw data. We have not estimated anything yet, so these are, you know, not really comparing apples to apples, a little bit, you know, more like comparing apples to bananas. All right, so what do we actually do, and how do we try to establish this this more sort of rigorous relationship between flexible employment and subjective well-being? Okay, so what we do is we use an event study with a fixed effects method, right? So here on the slide, I put down two model specifications. The first one is the base specification that allows us to estimate the trajectory of subjective well-being. Okay, so these main independent variables that I mentioned before are these period indicators, and these are these variables here. Right, so remember, this is just a series of dummy variables that tells us whether a child is born in time t, 1 period before, 2 periods before, 3 periods before, or 1 period after, 2 periods after, 3 periods after, 4 periods after, 5 periods after. Okay, so this is a set of 7 dummy variables. One is left out for a reference. And then we have this thick vector of job-related characteristics job, which contains those measures of flexibility. And then we have a whole bunch of other time-varying individual level characteristics, which are all these variables I mentioned before, such as income, partner situation, number of children, etc. And then we have individual fixed effects and time fixed effects. Okay, so individual fixed effects, this is going to be capturing everything that doesn't change over time for a given individual. Okay, so think about things like a personality that can affect whether people are you know, happy or not, and how they react to childbirth. Think about preferences. Think about anything that's constant over time and that can affect people's subjective well-being, as well as selection into jobs that are flexible or not. those can be captured by this individual effect. Now, we of course won't be estimating this alpha. This is something that drops out in the fixed effects method, but that is the beauty of having panel data, that we can control for all these time invariant things that can affect individual subjective well-being, as well as selection into these flexible jobs. And the reason why we want to be able to control for this is because if we don't, then we can no longer claim causal relationships between the variables in our model. All right, so everything that's time constant is taken care for by this individual effect, but obviously everything that is not time constant and that's omitted from the model is not. So this is not exactly bulletproof. It doesn't mean that we take all possible, that we can assume all possible problems away, but at least everything that that does not vary over time, or over the time period that we're looking at least is accounted for. Okay, so again, the first specification here just estimates the trajectory of subjective well-being, and the second specification extends the first one by introducing the interaction term between the period indicators and the indication of flexible employment. Okay, and that's exactly what we're trying to establish here. We're trying to see whether this access to flexible employment does alter the trajectory of subjective well-being around childbirth. Okay, so this really is the specification of interest. This the second one, and that's the one from which I'll be showing most of the results from. Okay. So why do we do it this way, right? Because we could think, well, you know, why going to so much trouble? Why don't we just compare people with children to people without children, and let's you know, see whether the people with children, compare people in flexible jobs with people in non-flexible jobs, and then see whether the ones in flexible jobs are happier than the one in non-flexible jobs. But the problem with this is that again, there might be these factors that affect both people happiness and selection into those flexible jobs that would be biasing our estimates. Okay, what also is known from the literature is that people really, you know, they're sort of born into a certain level of happiness. Okay, so that the well-being of a person is determined by social and biological endowments, and that's what's called the set point theory of happiness, which means that there is really a certain constant level of happiness that that people have on average for their lives, and these life events, such as the birth of the child, can obviously introduce some variations into these trajectories, but they're not permanent changes. Okay, and they cannot, you know, affect these permanent level of happiness in a significant way. Okay, so that's why we are not trying to sort of estimate the baseline level of happiness of people. What we're trying to do is see what are the variations from this baseline level of happiness for individuals, and then see if these variations can be affected by flexible employment. All right. Okay, well, we talked about fixed effects as well, so we can move on to the results. So this is the trajectory of subjective well-being of fathers and mothers that we estimate, or these are the coefficients of on these period indicators that we estimate from our models. So the reference point is the T-3, that's the omitted category, right? And in essence, if we see that the line is above 0, that means that people are happier in those periods than they were in T-3. And if we see that this is below 0, that means that people are less happy in those periods that they were in T-3. Okay, so we pretty much reproduce the shapes of these, trajectories of subjective well-being from the raw data and from the previous results that I showed you. Right, people, you clearly see this anticipation effect for both mother and fathers. We see that people are subjective well-being is increasing in anticipation of childbirth. Then there is this huge drop, especially for mothers, and then we see that slowly with time these trajectories go back to the original level, right? So the happiness levels go back to what they were 3 years before the birth of the child, right? So it seems like we're doing a good job in estimating the trajectory, although this is not of a core importance for us, right? Remember, we even if you know we can find the flaws with the estimation strategy of the trajectory itself, what we care about is how can we affect the trajectory of this flexible employment interaction. Okay, so even though I think we can claim that that we have a robust way of estimating this trajectory, this is not of a core importance to us. The next graphs are of a core importance to the results that we were sort of interested in finding. Okay, so what we see here is how do these trajectories differ between parents that are in different types of employment. Okay, and in the top left graph for men and contractual flexibility in terms of labor force status. So we're just looking at part-time, full-time working fathers and mothers, not looking at actual hours that we do in the bottom graphs. Again, we see that these fathers with that are non-employed have the lowest subjective well-being out of all fathers, and the full-time working fathers are the happiest. When we look at mothers, we see that the mothers that are working full-time, so have no contractual flexibility in essence, are the mothers with the highest drops in subjective well-being, and the mothers who are working part-time experience a much less drop in happiness after the child is born. Okay, and here when we look at hours, again, this just confirms the results of just full-time, part-time classification. The mothers that are working really long hours experience the biggest drop, and the mothers that decrease their working hours, they experience smaller drops. When we look at temporal flexibility and spatial flexibility, nothing is significant for mothers. So those two forms of flexible employment do not seem to affect mothers' subjective well-being in the transition to parenthood. But it seems that fathers who are entitled to both self-scheduling and home-based work seems to be happier than fathers that are not entitled to self-scheduling or home-based work. And this is only significant for fathers of very small children. So fathers of children that are about 1 or 2 years old. So again, this might be the time when mothers go back to work and fathers take up more responsibilities in terms of caring for the children, which could include taking kids to daycare, dropping them off, picking them up, and things like this, in which case having some flexibility at work, of course, decreases the stress related to combining work and family life. All right, so I think I am running out of time, so I'm not going to go into details of the robustness checks. I can just tell you that they all checked out. So we sort of we try to come up with things that could threaten our identification, and that the choices we've made that could affect the results, such that how do we treat that subjective well-being measure? Do we think of it as a cardinal or an ordinal measure? So we re-estimated the model under weaker assumptions, and again, results checked out. Results check out in different samples when we include different types of households. So when we include single parents, when we include homosexual parents, when we control for selection into industries and occupations, when we include older parents. So in all these checks that we could come up with, our results pretty much went through, and we can always see that it is the mothers that benefit from contractual flexibility, especially being entitled to a part-time job, and the fathers that are entitled to spatial and temporal flexibility, that their happiness seems to be higher than mothers or fathers that are not entitled to these forms of flexibility. Okay, so to conclude, I think we can claim that we find evidence that flexible employment is an effective tool to alleviate the drop in parental subjective well-being in the early years of parenthood. And we think that this is important because, well, first of all, if those things work, that this just motivates policies that try to make flexible employment sort of more popular, and it seems like in many countries there is a movement towards increasing flexibility of jobs of people, specifically because there is evidence that that increases people's subjective well-being. Then you know, this comes from Australia, which of course raises questions. You know, we are far away from Australia, so why do we care about Australia? But we think that we can generalize these results to parents in other developed countries where there is no large stigma related to flexible forms of employment. And lastly, there is you know, growing evidence that shows that, you know, happy parents have happy children. So through intergenerational transmission of happiness within a family, there are certain positive spillovers created on from happy parents to children, and that has positive effect on children development, which of course leads to better outcomes later in life. Okay, so I think that's it. Thank you for your attention, and I welcome any questions, comments, complaints. Yeah.
Dziękujemy bardzo pani doktor za tą bardzo ciekawą prezentację. Mam nadzieję, że pytania się pojawią. Zachęcamy Państwa do zadawania pytań na czacie. Bardzo proszę o wpisanie na czacie albo zgłoszenie się. Jest możliwość albo właśnie w formie bezpośredniej, ustnej, albo właśnie za pomocą czatu. Ten wykład, czy ta prezentacja właściwie pokazała nam właśnie, że praca elastyczna zmniejsza stres związany właśnie z konfliktem pomiędzy pracą a rodziną. Tutaj te różnice występują dość wyraźnie między kobietami a mężczyznami i to jest bardzo też ciekawa perspektywa, taka badawcza, która nasuwa też wiele pytań i zapewne można ten wątek dalej poddać badaniom. Jeśli tutaj zapraszamy Państwa, bardzo proszę o zadawanie pytań. Mnie osobiście by interesował ten wątek kulturowy, to zanim jeszcze nie mamy innych pytań, to chciałabym tutaj, o jest pytanie, super, to najpierw może zadamy pytanie, jest w języku angielskim. Czy pani doktor widzi to pytanie?
Zaraz zobaczę.
How many years after
how many years after childbirth does the subjective well-being return to the level from T-3? No więc based on our results, it seems like only at T+5, if at all. So our estimates show that these period indicators stop being significant at the T+5 indicator. So that would be the time when the subjective well-being goes back to pre T-3 levels. Yeah.
Dziękujemy. Proszę o kolejne pytania.
Yeah.
Tak, mamy feedback na odpowiedź. OK. Proszę o kolejne pytania. A jaką rolę odgrywa ten kontekst, jeśli mogę ja zapytać tutaj panią doktor, jaką rolę odgrywa kontekst taki geograficzny? Czy biorąc pod uwagę, że akurat my jesteśmy tutaj w Europie, czy te wyniki byłyby inne, czy jest to jakoś uwarunkowane kulturowo może? Jak pani doktor to ocenia?
Znaczy ja myślę, że są dwa czynniki, które są ważne. Pierwszy jest taki, że jakaś popularność tych form, no bo jeżeli niewystarczająco duża liczba osób korzysta z takich elastycznych form zatrudnienia, no to nic nie zobaczymy w tych danych. Tak musi być jakaś taka masa krytyczna, która która korzysta z jakichś właśnie elastycznych form zatrudnienia. No, ale drugi chyba ważniejszy aspekt jest taki, że w krajach, w których istnieje jakaś taka stygma związana na przykład z zatrudnieniem na niepełny etat, no, pracownicy nie będą wybierać takich prac nie ze
Oj, coś przerwało. Połączenie.
Są kraje takie jak na przykład Holandia, w której wyraźnie prawo mówi, że pracownicy na niecały etat są traktowani dokładnie tak samo jak pracownicy na cały etat, czyli mają takie same benefits, mają dokładnie takie same warunki pracy jak pracownicy na pełny etat, ale są kraje, w których to wygląda inaczej, tak? W których pracownicy w tych formach elastycznych są raczej marginalizowani, mają mniejsze poczucie bezpieczeństwa w pracy, nie mają stałych kontraktów, tylko czasowe kontrakty. I to wpływa na decyzje ludzi, na podejmowanie tych form pracy. A tu chodzi o to, żeby zobaczyć, czy ludzie, czy tutaj młodzi rodzice wybierają pewne formy pracy, bo im to pomaga pogodzić pracę z rodziną. I jeżeli są jakieś constraints, jakieś bariery na rynku pracy, no to wtedy nie obserwujemy optymalnych wyborów, tak? Tylko obserwujemy wybory, które są warunkowane właśnie tymi barierami. I wtedy nie wiem, czy wyniki byłyby inne, ale wtedy jakby inna grupa osób znajdowałaby się w tych elastycznych formach zatrudnienia, mniej reprezentacyjna.
Bardzo dziękuję. Jak widać, można też w języku polskim te pytania postawić. Zachęcam Państwa do skorzystania tutaj z wiedzy naszego eksperta, naszej ekspertki, o bardzo bogatym doświadczeniu i dorobku naukowym. Proszę o kolejne pytania. Nie ma pytań? Skoro nie ma pytań, no to w takim razie cóż, to bardzo dziękujemy Pani doktor za to bardzo ciekawe wystąpienie. Na pewno wniosło dużo do naszej też takiej perspektywy badawczej, gdyż mieliśmy okazję zobaczyć właśnie tutaj szeroką perspektywę i badawczą, metodologiczną, ale też taką empiryczną, bardzo mocną podstawę. Pojawiło się jakieś pytanie, widzę.
Tak,
to może...
widzę.
Tak.
Czy były jakieś istotne różnice, jeśli chodzi o branżę? My nie widzimy tego, ale jeśli dobrze pamiętam, to znaczy tak, może inaczej, bo nas jakby interesowało to, czy uwzględnienie branży czy zawodów zmieni te wyniki. No bo ryzyko jest takie, że są pewne branże, w których te prace takie elastyczne są bardziej rozpowszechnione niż inne. I niestety z punktu widzenia badawczego, metodologicznego często jest tak, że branże, w których większość pracowników stanowią kobiety, to są branże, które mają większy dostęp do takich elastycznych form zatrudnienia. Ale wydaje się, że w Australii do końca tak nie jest. Może wynika to z tego, że właśnie ta ustawa reguluje tak rynek pracy, że każdy pracownik jest uprawniony do tych elastycznych form pracy w pewnym zakresie oczywiście. Może wynika to z tego, że ta selekcja do branż nie jest aż taka silna w Australii, nie wiem, ale my nie zauważyliśmy, żeby były jakieś istotne różnice, jeśli chodzi o branżę, ale to jest bardzo dobre pytanie i myślę, że w wielu krajach takie różnice by się pojawiły. Bo jednak taka polaryzacja w branżach jest bardzo wysoka i szczególnie tutaj, jeśli chodzi o to jakby regulowanie godzin pracy. Może nie tyle ten self-scheduling czy miejsce pracy, ale jeżeli chodzi o właśnie dostosowywanie godzin pracy, to tu na pewno w wielu krajach branże miałoby bardzo duże znaczenie.
Dziękujemy za ten kolejny bardzo istotny wątek. Proszę bardzo. Zapraszamy do zadawania pytań. Proszę bardzo, mamy kolejne pytanie.
Czyli kiedy poziom zatrudnienia kobiet wraca do poziomu 100-3. No to tak jak już chyba mówiliśmy, że jeżeli w ogóle wraca, to widzimy, że tak około 5 lat po narodzinach dziecka. Ten poziom, poziom zatrudnienia kobiet. To zupełnie inne pytanie. No więc generalnie to nie wraca niestety. Generalnie wygląda na to, że bardzo dużo właśnie kobiet wychodzi z rynku pracy i już wiele poza tym rynkiem pracy pozostaje. Tutaj ja może pokażę te wykresy, które pokazywałam. Na początku tam chyba coś na ten temat można się dowiedzieć, jeśli dobrze pamiętam. Tutaj na tym prawym wykresie te niebieskie słupki pokazują jakby procent kobiet, która nie jest zatrudniona i tutaj widzimy, że ten procent bardzo wzrasta w roku, w którym dzieci się rodzą, że tak powiem, i potem on się zmniejsza, kobiety wracają do pracy, ale jednak więcej kobiet pozostaje poza rynkiem pracy niż było w okresie T-3, czyli 3 lata przed narodzinami dziecka. Znaczy ja w ogóle myślę, że to jest bardzo ważna sprawa, bo taka elastyczność pracy, jakby te wyniki, które my widzimy, że kobiety najbardziej reagują jakby na tą elastyczność pracy godzinową, niestety może nieść za sobą negatywne skutki właśnie takiej marginalizacji kobiet na rynku pracy, że wiele kobiet jakby zaczyna pracować na pół etatu, zmniejsza wymiar godzin pracy i już nie wraca do pełnowymiarowych kontraktów. No i oczywiście pytanie jest, czy nie wracają dlatego, bo nie chcą, czy nie wracają dlatego, bo nie mogą. I to jest pytanie, na które jeszcze nikt nie odpowiedział i na które my się zastanawiamy teraz. No ale jakby to jest wątek, który trzeba wziąć pod uwagę, żeby promowanie tych elastycznych form pracy nie doprowadziło do dalszej marginalizacji kobiet na rynku pracy właśnie. I tutaj też właśnie ten kontekst ma duże znaczenie, bo w państwach, w których te elastyczne formy pracy wiążą się z gorszymi warunkami pracy, no może mieć to dość negatywne, długoterminowe skutki na sytuację kobiet na rynku pracy właśnie.
Bardzo dziękujemy. Czy są kolejne pytania? Są. Bardzo proszę, pani Ada zadaje kolejne pytanie. Cieszymy się bardzo.
Tak, pytanie o dostępność opieki nad dzieckiem w Australii, bardzo dobre pytanie. No więc jest możliwość oczywiście, ale to taki trochę amerykański system jest, czyli tam są, to jest wszystko, system jest prywatny, żłobki, przedszkola są dość drogie, więc jest to na pewno pewne ograniczenie, które powoduje, że wiele kobiet właśnie musi dostosowywać swoją pracę do sytuacji właśnie dostępności opieki nad dziećmi. Ale no, teoretycznie powinna być to opcja dostępna dla wszystkich, ale w praktyce no chyba jest tak jak wszędzie, że nie do końca teoria się zgadza z tym, co się dzieje w rzeczywistości. Także to jest oczywiście bardzo ważny wątek, który trzeba uwzględnić, jak się zastanawia nad tymi tematami, że tak powiem. To ja dziękuję za pytania bardzo.
Dokładnie. Okej, mamy właśnie kolejny wątek, czyli ta dostępność przedszkoli czy tych żłobków może też mieć wpływ na ten rozwój elastyczny form zatrudnienia, że to wymusza jakby też rozwój w tym kierunku, że jest jakby zainteresowanie ze strony rodziców czy osób posiadających dzieci, które właśnie mogą sobie wybrać, czy właśnie skorzystać z publicznej oferty żłobka, czy też samemu jednak skorzystać z ofert elastycznych na rynku pracy i zająć się dzieckiem. Czyli to też zależy od tego.
To też tak jest, że bardzo często to jest taka zero-jedynkowa gra niestety, że albo się pracuje i dzieci jakby oddaje się do przedszkola czy żłobka na cały tydzień, albo się nie pracuje. I raczej chodzi o to chyba, żeby wypracować jakieś takie pośrednie rozwiązania, no bo wiele kobiet jednak nie czuje się, ciekawe, że cały czas mówię o kobietach, a jakoś mężczyźni nie biorą, jakby nie wchodzą w tą dyskusję, no bo niestety jest tak, że to w większości kobiety zawsze przejmują te obowiązki nad dziećmi, szczególnie małymi dziećmi. No i żeby kobiety mogły nie zupełnie zrywać kontakt z rynkiem pracy, szczególnie w tych początkowych okresach, żeby miały bardziej właśnie elastyczną, żeby te formy opieki nad dziećmi były bardziej elastyczne. No ale to jakby to ciągle wszystko niestety w mojej jakby ocenie może prowadzić do długoterminowych negatywnych skutków na rynku pracy niestety dla kobiet. Jeżeli się równocześnie nie będzie pracowało nad tym, żeby właśnie te warunki pracy były takie, jak być powinny i przede wszystkim, żeby warunki rozwoju w pracy żeby na to niepełnowymiarowe zatrudnienie nie miało zbyt negatywnego wpływu.
Bardzo ważny wątek. Dokładnie. Czy są jeszcze jakieś pytania? Pani Ada nie ma więcej pytań, bo tutaj bardzo aktywnie uczestniczyła. Bardzo dziękujemy Pani Adzie. Zachęcamy też pozostałe osoby. Jest okazja, aby się dowiedzieć tutaj bardzo szczegółowych rzeczy od naszego prelegenta. Nie widać więcej pytań. W takim razie bardzo serdecznie dziękuję Pani doktor za to dzisiejsze wystąpienie. Mam nadzieję, że trochę to wniosło też, jakby odświeżyło naszą perspektywę, która jest no, trochę inna, jeśli chodzi o funkcjonowanie, o taką rzeczywistość. Ale dobrze wiedzieć, że na innych kontynentach, w innych krańcach świata te problemy są inaczej rozwiązywane. Dziękuję również Państwu za tą aktywną tutaj, za ten udział w tym wystąpieniu, w tym seminarium, które było właśnie organizowane w ramach projektu Społeczno-gospodarcze konsekwencje czwartej rewolucji przemysłowej, szczególnie w ramach problemu węzłowego dotyczącego nowych relacji przemysłowych. Więc te zagadnienia, które były dzisiaj tutaj poruszane, są jak najbardziej przedmiotem również badawczym w ramach projektu, który jest realizowany przez naszą uczelnię w ramach programu Regionalna Inicjatywa Doskonałości.